Hello everyone, welcome back to Cloud Pedagogy. Today we are going to implement AWS Global Infrastructure scenario in our lab student directory application. So for our student directory application, we will be using photos of each of our students. We have to store them somewhere safe. Currently the only copy of these photos are saved on my laptop right now. But if my laptop breaks, then what happens? No more photos, right? I want to make sure this doesn't happen. So I'm going to upload the photos to AWS to ensure that the copies exist even if my laptop is destroyed. This also allows me to access my photos from anywhere, my home, my phone, in a plane or on a train, everywhere. So when I store these photos in an AWS service, I'm storing it in a data center somewhere and servers inside the data center. But if a natural disaster happens or a fire accident, then what do we do? Luckily, AWS has planned for this event and many others too, like including natural disasters and other unavoidable accidents. The way they plan for it is through redundancy. AWS clusters data centers together around the world. So here AWS might have a second data center connected to the first data center through redundant high-speed and low-latency links. That way, if the first data center goes down, the second data center is still up and running. This cluster of data centers is called an availability zone or AZIS, as we have already mentioned in the previous class. An AZ consists of one or more data centers with redundant power, networking and connectivity. Unfortunately, sometimes natural disasters like hurricanes or earthquakes might also extend to impacting an entire AZ. But AWS has planned for that too, with redundancy. Like data centers, AWS also clusters AZs together and also connects them with redundant high-speed and low-latency links. A cluster of AZs is simply called a region. In AWS, you get to choose the location of your resources by picking a region. Regions are generally named by location so you can easily tell where they are. For example, I could put our student photos in a region in North Virginia called N Virginia region. And remember, AWS is not going to name a region in Germany after North Virginia. As a basic rule, there are 4 aspects you need to consider when deciding which AWS region to use: compliance, latency, price, and service availability. Let's start with compliance. Before any other factors, you must first look at your compliance requirements. You might find that your application, company, or country that you live in requires you to handle your data and IT resources in a certain way. Do you have a requirement that your data must live in the UK boundaries? Then you should choose the London region. None of the rest of the factors even matter. Or if you operate in Canada, then you must be required to run inside the Canada Central region. But if you don't have a compliance or regulatory control dictating your region, then you can look at the other factors. For example, our student photos are not restricted by regulations, so I can continue looking at the next factor, which is latency. Latency is all about how close your IT resources are to your user base. If I want every student around the world to be able to view the student photos quickly, then I should place the infrastructure that hosts those photos close to my students. We are all bound by the speed of light. Applied to your business, that means if all of your users live in Oregon, then it makes sense to run your application in the Oregon region. You could run it in Brazil region, but the latency from Oregon to Brazil might impact your users and create slower load times. But maybe I really want to run my application or store my student photos in Brazil. One problem I might run into is the pricing, which is the next factor we will talk about. The pricing can vary from region to region. So it may be that some regions like the Sao Paulo region are more expensive than others due to different tax structures. So even if I want to store my student photos in Brazil, it might not make sense from the latency perspective or the pricing perspective. And then finally, the fourth factor you will want to consider is the services you want to use. Often when we create new services or new features in AWS, we don't roll out those services to every region we have right away. Meaning, if you want to begin using a new service on day one after it launches, then you will want to make sure it operates in the region that you are looking at running your infrastructure in. To recap, region, availability zones, and data centers exist in a redundant nested sort of way. There are data centers inside availability zones and availability zones inside regions. And how do you choose a region? By looking at compliance, latency, pricing, and service availability. I hope now you got a clear understanding how our student directory application fits in the AWS global infrastructure. See you in my next video. Until then, bye.